centered around the war, centered around the war on poverty. And I'm happy to report on Jenny's behalf that
That is
since
correct. And then there's a meeting number.
after the action went out, Results Domestic has had 14 media pieces published on the war on poverty, 9 op-eds, 4 letters to the editor, and 1 article. Really great progress is being made, probably by some of you guys on this call. Was there a question?
You tried the 1-201-479? Okay.
Tonight, our focus is on meeting face-to-face with editorial boards and writers. And I guess at this time, I'll just turn it over to Colin Smith to sort of take us through our webinar. Colin?
Sure, thanks. I'm really delighted to be on tonight with all of you, and thanks to everybody for joining. Tonight, we decided to take on this issue because, as many of you know, we're in the middle of, or really kicking off in earnest, a big media push around global education, where we're going to be pushing the U.S. administration to be making a commitment this June of $250 million over 2 years to the Global Partnership for Education, which will help contribute to getting and supporting quality education for 29 million kids around the world. And we have some really ambitious goals for this media push. We're aiming to get 25 editorials, 30 op-eds, a whole bunch of letters to the editor, and we're going to be really sort of beating that drum over the course of the next 4 months to get the action that we want this June for kids around the world. We have a whole slew of different resources available around this specific push, and tonight we wanted to take a second to step back and focus on one specific sort of tool that all of us can use in this work, and that's face-to-face editorial board meetings. My hope is that what we talk about tonight is useful not just in the context of generating an editorial right now around this issue, but in the longer term and on both the domestic and the global side, really forming relationships with editorial writers that can be useful to us in drawing attention to the range of our issues now and into the future. We know that editorials are one of the most effective pieces of media that we can create in order to have an impact advocacy-wise, and one of the best ways to get editorials is through meeting face-to-face, in the same way that we meet face-to-face with our members of Congress and use that as one of our sort of best strategies. Same thing holds true with editorial writers. So taking just a second to step back and think about these meetings, I thought it would be useful to do a quick run-through of who editorial writers are. And this isn't rocket science, but I think it's important that we sort of keep this in mind, and it's something that I am constantly reminding myself of in my work with the media. So on the one hand, editorial writers and really journalists more broadly are overworked, they're underpaid, they're really stretched thin. Their jobs are being threatened right now. There's a lot going on. And so we sort of see journalists and writers as these sort of scary and busy folks. But on the other hand, we see them as passionate and hardworking and really intelligent, informed people who really have the ability to make a difference. You know, none of them are in it for the money. They're doing this work because they think the media is a good way to make a difference in the world, and that's the contribution that they want to make in their careers. So really considering all of those different pieces and who editorial writers are can be important in thinking about the way that we approach them. The most important thing to keep in mind about editorial writers, of course, however, is that they are people. And really tapping into that human behind the editorial is central to our success. No one writes anything in a vacuum. So finding ways to convince people, to get them engaged on our issues, to make them think doing this is important, and to motivating them to act depends on sort of tapping into the human being who's doing the writing and who's taking on what we're asking them to take on. And so in this little slide here, the folks who are outlined in the box are all faceless human beings. And my hope is that in our work with editorial writers, we can work to put faces on those bodies so that we have a sense of who we're working with and who can help us reach our goals. So sort of stepping back and thinking about the fact that editorial writers are human beings, we're reminded of the fact that just like all of us, they respond well to things like praise and gratitude and positive reinforcement and support, but they respond less well to things like critique and demands and spam and things they're not looking for. And again, these are not sort of revolutionary ideas, but really sort of stepping back and constantly reminding ourselves that when we're sending off email requests to writers, we are not just sending them into a sort of empty submission box. We're sending them to someone who's going to open them and read them and bring to that reading all the biases and sort of emotional baggage that we as human beings have. So figuring out how to tap into that and take advantage of people's strengths and interests is central. So I wanted to really zoom in on that third bullet under good ways to build trust, and that's support. Editorial writers in this country are getting fewer and farther between with every passing year, which means they are forced to cover enormous amounts of content. They're expected to have opinions that they can back up on the full range of issues facing their communities in our country and the world, and that's a really hard task. And so we actually have something to offer our editorial writers, which is the support they need to editorialize on important issues that they might not otherwise have the time to explore and get familiar with. But the tricky piece is that what support and help looks like to individual writers is really going to vary from person to person. What an editorial writer takes up is not only motivated by what's local and what's newsworthy, it's motivated by what his or her editor is interested in. It's motivated by their personal interests, their own individual biases and life experiences. And so for us to get to understand all of those different pieces that are going into decisions at the editorial level, really accessing the human behind those decisions is an important and hopefully fruitful step. So why meet face-to-face? As we mentioned earlier, it's both to generate editorials now in the short term around global education, but also to lay the groundwork for our future success. So a little bit of a step-by-step, and I encourage all of you to take a glance at the the activist milestone on results.org that deals with this issue. And while you're doing it, sort of keeping in mind all of the sort of media best practices that we've talked about over the years and that this group is so familiar with. But a few sort of pointers and sort of what the process looks like. The first step I put here is start yesterday. There's never a time that's too soon to begin laying the foundation for these sorts of relationships. And that holds true even before we have a specific ask for editorial writers. So it could be sending people a quick note, letting them know that you like something that they wrote. It could be sending them a quick note saying you thought something was particularly interesting. It could be sort of pegging off of something that a writer does is one of the best ways to lay the groundwork for a future ask. But even without that step, if we haven't taken it yet, we're not too late. It's always good to start yesterday, but if we didn't start yesterday, we can start today. And the first step is really getting to know the editorial page inside and out, because that's our best window into the person who's writing those editorials, is what they're putting on the paper or in the paper. So reading editorials can be a hugely informative way to figure out how to pitch them. And it sounds like the most straightforward piece of advice you could imagine, but it's really true. Understanding the perspective that a certain writer has enables us to sort of break through and to offer things that might be of interest to that person. I had the great pleasure of being out with some of our Northern California groups last weekend at their regional conference, and we were talking about the the fact that getting people to support us on our issues doesn't necessarily always mean using the same approach with everyone we're talking to, and that what works for one person on one side of the political spectrum might not work for the other person, even if they're going to ultimately wind up making the same decision. It might be a different set of arguments, a different rationale that helps them get there. And so figuring out what it is, not only that we want this person to do, but what's going to be the most convincing argument to get them there, what's going to be the most compelling angle to get them there, is something that reading the editorial pages can really help us understand. So the next step, and again, seemingly pretty straightforward, is getting clear on the ask. Are we writing to editorial writers to ask to set up a meeting? Are we writing to them to editorialize on a specific topic? Does that topic have a time and a moment when it's particularly relevant? And being really clear on what we want them to do and when we want them to do it is essential to getting that action to happen. The next two steps we have bolded in big letters here, because this is the stage in the process that is perhaps the most time-consuming, but also the place where we'll have the biggest payoff. And this is figuring out how we can really sort of tap into what an individual writer might be willing to publish. Thinking back to all of our sort of news values that we talk about, not only around editorials, but around op-eds and letters to the editor and everything else, is really important even before we're pitching the meeting or pitching editorials or sending media requests. And that's because if we can't demonstrate the newsworthiness of what we want to talk about, there's no reason for that person to take the meeting with us. So thinking about how to make it newsworthy, how to make it relevant, how to make it local is really essential. Up on this slide we have, let's see here, 7 different suggestions. There are limitless suggestions in this regard in terms of how to tailor a meeting request to a specific human being. Today I was sending out meeting requests around tuberculosis with World TB Day coming up next week, and we have a few visitors in Washington, D.C., and I sent out maybe 7 or 8 different media requests over the course of the day, and each of them looked a little bit different. And the person who I had to offer in terms of her expertise didn't change from email to email, but it was figuring out what does this writer, really care about? What does this writer interested in that made it relevant and useful to that person? So thinking through that for your writer is essential. So getting to know your reporter or your writer in this case. What does he or she care about? What has he or she written on in the past? What's their political sort of position and approach? Thinking about drawing parallels, not putting things in contrast, not sort of setting up local issues and global issues in sort of a competitive one against the other framework, but figuring out how to draw useful, sort of productive parallels that everyone has, what are shared experiences. In the case of education, it's recognizing that we actually face really similar challenges sometimes in the United States as other countries do around education. It might be teacher training. It might be establishing functional curriculums. It might be figuring out how to support parents at home as they're working with their children. These are issues that are really universal. So figuring out ways to make comparisons that are fruitful and productive as opposed to pitting one issue against another. The next 2 things on here, telling a story and using a specific example. This is something that we've all heard over and over again, and sometimes it can be a challenge to get that personal voice to really give a perspective on an issue that says, this is why it's important to me and my community. If you've got that, fantastic. Use it. Engage a person to really tell his or her own story in the work that you're doing. But if you can't find someone who sort of has that local connection to you and a personal connection to the issue, use a specific example to really drive things home. So maybe finding, in this case of global education, finding a country that's facing particular education challenges and being specific about those and perhaps how they relate to your community, whether it's a country that from which a lot of people in your community, where they were born and immigrated from, or if you have a specific country that's of interest for political reasons or geographic reasons, finding that sort of concrete example can really help drive home the point for an editorial writer and really give them something to think about if they're going to generate a piece of media for you. Next, demonstrating the local payoff. Figuring out what it is that an investment in global education can help provide for our communities. Using the editorial packet that we have, hopefully you'll see a few suggestions that are useful and helpful in terms of thinking about gender equality and economic development and security and democracy and how all of those things come together around education and the profound impact that they have not only on children who are being educated in individual countries, but how education sort of has a significant global payoff in all of those different areas for us. Putting things in context, helping people understand the figures that we're talking about. $250 million seems like a lot of money. 29 million children seems like an incomprehensibly large number and something that we just really don't have context for. So how can we sort of break down numbers, help things seem more accessible to writers, and in the process help things feel more relatable? And then the final piece here, and this is my personal favorite, is recruiting local allies. Finding someone in your community who can speak about why global education is so important, not necessarily because she or he has a personal story tied to growing up in another country, but because she or he has seen the impact of global education. This might be a teacher in the local community who thinks focusing our efforts on global education is equally important. That person right away brings a local angle to the story because that person can say, from my perspective in Dallas public schools or Minneapolis public schools or Seattle public schools has shown me the value of education, and I think that's important that we extend that to people all across the world. It might be partnering with a group that has focused on these issues in the past. The Girl Scouts did a lot with Malala. It might be a university in your area that has partnerships with institutions overseas and benefits from that relationship. There are really just a huge number of opportunities, but they vary from place to place. In this slide here, you'll see there's a link at the bottom that I'd really encourage you to take a look at and use as a brainstorming tool because there's no monopoly on the ideas here, but this tool hopefully provides a few different sort of nuggets that could be helpful in thinking about who in your own community might be your best ally for going with you to an editorial board meeting and really providing some nice complementary perspective to the issue. If you're the issue area expert, they can be the ones to really bring the local tie-in. So I'd encourage everyone to think hard and long about the ways in which we can tailor our requests to make them the most accessible that they can be to our writers. Which brings us to perhaps the most pivotal moment in the process, which is putting together a meeting request. And this is a challenge. There's no perfect meeting request. There's no perfect length. There's no perfect list of things to include. But we can sort of talk through a few pointers and a few do's and don'ts. And the first do is make it as short as possible. Writers are, as we discussed, overstretched and overworked and underpaid, and so sending them long emails with additional information that is unnecessary or uninteresting to them is a sure way to get things deleted right off the bat. So this email that I have up here on the screen might be a starting point. I think this email could be cut about in half and still be equally effective. But so what are the basics in here? An introduction about who I am, but before that, it's taking a moment to offer something to the editorial writer to let them know that this email is to them and them alone, and that you've taken the time to read what they write, you've thought about what you're saying to them, and that they should take the time to read the email that you've developed to send to them. Then an introduction, and then immediately a local connection. If possible, a local connection that ties back to something the editorial board writer has already, the editorial writer has already written. So in this case, this is a made-up example, but leading with a thank you for an editorial that was produced on a local school issue, and then saying on the heels of that local school issue, I've been working with one of our school board members, and together we really care about global education in addition to local education. So getting to that point would have required recruiting a local school board member to join you and find someone who's sold on this issue. But then it sets you up in this incredibly powerful way to make an ask that's not only tied back to something the editorial writer has already done, but has that built-in local angle that someone needs today. As more and more papers are downsizing, they're focusing in a hyper-local way, and the local connection is essential to our success. So then moving on to your specific ask. I thought you'd be interested in taking a look at this issue and what it means to us here, and that is really important tie-in is, again. Then this next paragraph, if I were sending this email out, I honestly might even delete it. I think it's a strong bit of context about what we're really asking for, and I think it can be really important to include. But for as many writers as not, including that information will sort of sell some writers on what you want to say, and others it'll mean they won't get to your ultimate question. So thinking about how much information do I want to include. Could I get it down into 2 lines? Could I get it down into 1 line? If I need to, I'll bump it up into 3 or 4. But then using that space to really lay out why this issue matters, why you care about it, and some of the background. And then make an ask for the meeting. Can we come in and talk about this quickly? I'm attaching a little bit of background information, and you can then send them the editorial packet. And I'd love to talk to you about what this means for us here, politically, economically, morally. And sign it off, and you're on your way. This email is the most important. This is the moment where you can make your initial contact. So getting it right is really critical. After the email is done, however, the process is not over. It's fairly rare, unfortunately, that editorial writers or other journalists, as probably many of you have experienced, are going to get back to you immediately. We wish that they would, and if they do, then fantastic, and let us all know your secrets. But if not, the next step is following up, and that can be done via email, that can be done over the phone, and depending on who you're calling, it might vary what's going to be the most effective. But in that follow-up, being, just like in the email, really concise and to the point. If you're making a call, starting the call by saying, "Hi, this is Colin Smith with Results. I sent you an email last week. I'm wondering if you have 2 minutes to talk with me about global education." And if they do, have that 2-minute spiel down and ready to go so that you can make your pitch and ask for the meeting right there on the go. If you're sending a follow-up email, keeping it to 1 line or 2 lines, just flagging for them that you haven't heard back and you'd love to stay in touch. So be persistent. We know this is something that Results volunteers are outstanding at, is persistence and dedication to these issues. So showing that same level of persistence with editorial writers as we do with our members of Congress is key. And then the final point in here, and I put it in brackets because I hope it's not the sort of final answer, but it's have a backup. What's your backup ask? In the event that your editorial writer says, "You know what, I'm sorry, I can't meet," or, "You know what, I'm sorry, I'm not going to editorialize on this," what's your backup ask? If they say they can't meet, say, "Okay, could I swing by the office and drop off some content for you?" Someone shared that example with me last week that then resulted in a longer relationship because the ask was, do you have 30 seconds for me to swing by your office and give something to you, or do you have 30 seconds to talk with me on the phone? And then in that 30 seconds, was able to hook that person and get them interested and get them engaged and eventually lead to success. If they say no to that, can you say, would you be willing to run an op-ed? Would you be willing to accept a letter to the editor? What's your sort of backup plan so that as the editorial writer, or if the editorial writer says no, which we hope he or she won't, we've got something else to offer them so that we can get the media that we need in whatever shape it comes in. So then once you're in the meeting, a few final thoughts here, and then I'm going to quit talking, and I want to hear what others have to say and what folks think about this. But going into that meeting, if a writer says yes, step one is have a plan. Who's going to say what? How are they going to do it? And how are we going to quickly and efficiently and compellingly convince this writer that this is an important issue for them to take up in their paper? Next step, practice, practice, practice. Have your spiel down. And remember why you're there. Have that ask in mind ready to go so that you're moving through the meeting with purpose and with a plan. And then really, really important, not only to getting that editorial in the short run, but even more importantly in the longer term as we're building relationships, is the listening piece. Getting to know your editorial writer and know what he or she thinks and how he or she responds to your questions and your comments and what seems interesting, what are they nodding their head at. Those are our cues to not only where we should take the meeting, but how we can build a relationship in the longer term. Which then, walking away from the meeting, how do we turn it into success? Step one is a big thank you. It's offering whatever follow-up the person needs. And then it's staying engaged in the long run so that meeting, hopefully it generates an editorial for us, but then that can be a foundational step and a first step in a relationship rather than a done deal and, take your editorial and go home. But we use that as the foundation for future success. At this point, I think I'll turn it over to John, who will make a couple of introductions to some folks who can actually speak about these things in real terms and about the experiences they've had. Before we do that, well, actually, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, Colin, thanks a lot, and hello, everyone. The two people who are going to share with us are going to actually illustrate some of the principles that Colin has been talking about. And then after they've made their 5-minute or so shares with us, then we'll have time to go back and ask questions of Colin, ask questions of our two guest sharers. So hopefully that will answer all your questions by the time the hour is up. So for our first share, we have Deanna Roberts-Blair. She's from Indianapolis. She works at the Children's Museum there. And Deanna, are you there?
Yes, I am. Okay. Hi, everybody. Well, I've kind of been going... Oh. I've kind of been going through my memories just to get all this together, and I remember the first time I tried to contact our editor, who was Tim, and I came back from the IC, and I thought I had this great idea for an op-ed, and I was so excited, and I tried to get in touch with him, and as we talked about earlier, well, some are more responsive than others, and so I tried again, and a couple more times, tried to politely get in touch. Well, I did catch him, and he was very polite and courteous, and I could obviously tell he was, trying to be sensitive to what I was saying, but there again, as we said earlier, very overworked and underpaid, and it just, I could tell it was not going to happen. So, okay, I was very discouraged, but, persistence is key, so we tried to go back to the drawing board and see what we could do. Well, Lisa Marshall met up with one of our editorial writers at a local event and mentioned that she was with Results. And he said, Results? That sounds really familiar. Results, I know I've read something. Was Nick Arena in that? Yes. And he remembered some things that Nick and the group that had been in Indy before had published. So he was a lot more open to hearing what we had to say. And so we contacted him when there was a TV seminar through Lilly, which Results also had a part of, through Lilly Corporation. And we secured a meeting for that. And Carol, who was traveling from Africa, also met with him. And we sat and had a wonderful, wonderful meeting. And they actually wrote the editorial for that. So that was several lessons that using something special, something unique, like having a visitor, was really helpful. Plus, we were talking about community allies, and having a big corporation like Lilly that was focused on the TB issue really helped us to get the focus on that for the editorial. We've had several either editorials or op-eds with Dan's help, and there again we've used a group called OBOT Helpers, which is focused on microfinance in Bangladesh. So we used their experience and their pull to get an editorial for that. We've written on World AIDS Day, but a lot of that was due to just having a person who was really passionate in the editorial department about foreign interest in foreign aid. And so having that person on our side was really helpful. And even it really, having Dan's input really even turned Tim's head too, and got Tim a little more softened up towards that. Unfortunately, Dan has retired, which was a very sad day for us and the city. But we emailed Tim to ask who we should speak to, who would be someone who could help us. And he got right back and said that another local writer who we'd worked with years ago through Alternative News Weekly is going to be doing a monthly column. So we're hoping to work with him, too. So a lot of the... I was sitting here nodding my head as I was looking at these slides going, yep. A lot of these things, the persistence, the using community connections, using special things that are going on as hooks, going maybe a different direction if you're not getting a real response from your editor, which is what we did with kind of getting another writer who was a little more passionate, a little more responsive to those particular issues. So those are definitely all things that helped us get things published that we wanted to get out into the community. Does anyone else have questions on? Or?
Well, how about if we move on to our next share? Thank you very much, Deanna. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to review what you said and what Willie will say in context with Colin's slides. So next up is Willie Dickerson. He's from Snohomish, Washington, which is just north of Seattle, and is part of the group there. Willie, are you there?
I am.
Great.
So I can go ahead?
Proceed. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we have had some good luck in our area. Teresa Rugg, our group leader, had built a a relation before with the person at the Everett Herald. Unfortunately, they were gone, but she just went ahead and asked the person who was there, whose wife happened to work at PATH in Seattle, which is an important ally of ours. So that was kind of a no-brainer, and we were able to get an op-ed in that we wrote. And then for myself personally, the most luck I have had is approaching editors in papers that I've had letters published in. So I had several letters published in a small paper nearby called the Lake Stevens Journal, and that editor was very approachable because she's one of the few employees there. And she was, after reading my letters and publishing them, and I was thanking her for them, and I emailed her and asked her if she would be interested in writing an editorial about the Global Fund. And she said, tell me more, and so I did, and said, if you would like more additional information, I'd be happy to send it to you. And she did, and so we sent her more information, some of the things from results. In the final editorial, she ended up quoting results 2 or 3 times, and even though the editorial wasn't as timely as I would have preferred, it did come, and, she said, I'm going to do this, but as we all know, they're very busy people, and they have their own system of what comes first and where they're at and what they have to write about. She is currently telling me she's also interested in writing about education for all, and I have sent her information about that too. So by first writing a letter to the editor that was published and then using that as a way to talk to the editor has worked with that particular paper. I have also been working with some other columnists that I have emailed a number of times and haven't had success with yet, but they're starting. I feel like they're starting to get to know me. We're starting to have a relationship, and perhaps in the future, something might come of that as well. So that's basically what I have to say. Besides the don't give up and keep writing, but definitely don't overburden them. I like that idea of short. The most success I've had has been via email and one phone conversation. So, and that particular editor, we're hoping will speak at one of our meetings in the future. So, there you have it.
Great. Thanks, Willie. That's always fun to hear what new ideas you come up with. Willie spoke at our regional conference and gave a very entertaining account of how he's successful in getting letters published. So maybe we'll hear more from him in future calls. So, Colin, having heard our 2 shares, I wonder if you could kind of reflect back on what you heard them say and your own pitch. And then I'd like to also encourage the rest of you to participate in this discussion. So, Colin?
Yeah, well, excuse me. Thanks so much, Dan and Willie. And hearing both of you talk, I was really struck by, on the one hand, I'm hearing these really sort of individual and personal circumstances that feel like, oh, perhaps those don't transfer as much because we have a writer who's particularly passionate, or we have this connection there. Or we have someone who works at PATH. But I think that really gets at that you 2 have done what's so important, which is finding that connection, finding that way in which you can really approach someone on a personal and on a individualized level, and that's really exciting. And obviously there are people out there where and papers out there where we will sort of be, run into brick walls. But I think both of you really pointed to the ways in which, by sort of maneuvering and getting creative and finding new paths in, you were able to really build success. So I think those were both phenomenal.
Great. Thanks, Colin. And I'd like to open it up to anybody out there who has either questions for Colin or our two share people, or some comments of your own.
Can I make this very quick? This is Leslie in Stanford. I wasn't able to open up the computer meeting, but while I was sitting at our computer, it turns out that the editor that had previously written an editorial about another topic sent me an email saying, Leslie, I happened to be in another room and I didn't get my phone call and I didn't get my message, but I'll look at this. I sent the piece having to do with Malala and the value of education. And so he's going to take a look at it, and I told him that, you know, if he needs other information, I can get it to him. So I'm very pleased that something may be written.
Well, that's terrific, and all during our media call too. That's amazing. Congratulations. I hope that moves forward. Anybody else want to comment on what they've heard tonight, or have some other contributions?
Well, this is Sherry from Cincinnati, and I'm with the Columbus group, with Jenny's group. And what I hear is really, really encouraging to me is, you know, how to really get into find out what the editor is interested in, you know, is something that, you know, will really have them, like, listen to you, you know, like, listen to what they're interested in. And I really like that. And I like the steps, you know, that were given earlier about, you know, planning what you are going to say, practice your spiel like that, and listen, and you know, just make sure that you clearly ask what you want to ask so that they hear it, and saying thank you, and you know, that whole list of things I think was really helpful. And then lastly, I just got a piece. It wasn't for results, but it was like there was a personal thing that happened in our neighborhood that I was a part of, and it got in the news, the local news, you know, and we wrote a letter to the editor, you know, thanking everyone that was involved with it. And I'm thinking what I can do is build on that relationship that we already started, you know, for now, you know, coming back to that same editor that, you know, published that piece. And I think that would be really helpful. And I didn't even, you know, really think about that.
Oh, terrific.
Absolutely. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah, no, this has opened up that big time for me. So thank you.
Great. Other comments or questions for Colin or Deanna or Willie?
This is Frank. I wanted to just touch on something that Deanna said. She said, and we run into this a lot. I mean, many of us run into things like this. She said, you know, he was on our side. He was on the same kind, you know, for the same kinds of issues and things like that. And that's true. You know, a lot of our Congress are on our side. They're concerned. They want to do, you know, something bold and meaningful. But it's really, in Deanna's case, it's her and her group, their actions, you know, big, small, coincidental, serendipitous, calling back allies, visitors, experts, whatever they needed to do. It's really those actions that she's talking about that are really moving him to write. A lot of people are on our side. So, you know, it's really good for us to have strategies to get to them. And So I just kind of wanted to underscore that.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Willie or Deanna, do you have any comments about what Colin said, or each other, or the audience?
Yeah, one of the things I kind of glazed over was having the local connection. And for example, in our Education for All op-ed, we talked about the local school district in Everett that had tailed one of their levies and connected it with that. And indeed, most of the comments online ended up being about that aspect, about their levy passing. But, having that local connection is so important. And then also if you aren't getting through to someone, remember there's more than one newspaper around. Some of them are smaller, but it's amazing how many people read that. And I think that's the heart of America in a way, is the small papers. So don't overlook them.
Absolutely, and this is Colin. And Willie, I would add to that sometimes the small papers can be a point of entry to the larger papers. That having an op-ed run somewhere, working with an editorial writer, can not only sort of sharpen our skills, but also give us the credibility to then hit some of the bigger outlets around the country. So that's great.
Other comments, questions? Well, great. Well, Frank, I'm going to turn it back to you if there are no other questions or comments for the wrap-up. And I do know that some people who would love to get a hold of
I have to leave because of Joss's call.
Okay.
But I sent a message to Ken asking him to please keep me informed.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being on the call. Well, thank everyone for being on the call. Deanna, thank you for sharing, and Willie, thank you for jumping in so quickly. I don't know if I'm stepping over anybody's comments or last questions. Please feel free. Colin, I might put it to you to maybe if you have any closing remark you want to make, but I will say before you do that, that our next call, I just lost the date. Who's got it? My screen was
Third Tuesday.
Third Tuesday of April, which is the, it can't be right.
Hang on. I got it.
The 15th.
The 15th, yes. April 15th. Tax Day. So we'll not have any trouble remembering that. This call was recorded, and, of course, the slides, I think, may be available. Is that right?
Yep, and they'll be recorded together with it'll all be one big package. So.
Great. And so, Colin, do you have anything you want to wrap up with before we go?
Sure. I sort of, as you were talking there, I was racking my brain, and I think three things that I'd sort of say at the end of our time here tonight. And one is that we would love to be support to all of you and to each other as we're all embarking on this media push in the months ahead, and then also even beyond that. But offering personally to be of support to all of you, and I know the RC Media Points join me in that, and John, I apologize. I'm seeing on this slide a typo in your name. So my apologies for that. So one, an offer to be of support and to keep your eyes peeled on the weekly updates and other information coming out. We have this local tip sheet. We have sample meeting requests. We have, we've already had 2 versions of the editorial packet, and we'll have at least one more. There's a whole bunch of really rich information on the Global Partnership for Education that our colleagues working on the policy side have put together. So really encourage everybody to take advantage of those great resources. And then secondly, I'm thinking of an email that Frank sent me earlier today, reminding me and reminding all of us that maintaining relationships is even more than just setting up these meetings, and that thinking about how we can sustain these sorts of contacts and relationships in the long run is sort of yet another issue to address and unpack together. So that's something I look forward to continuing to explore with everybody. And then finally, let's get to it. We have really ambitious goals for the next couple of months, and I feel confident that we can reach them together. But let's get down to work.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you all for being on tonight. I know there was NCAA games you could have been watching, but you chose to be here, so thanks.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye, all. Thank you.